I'm Ian Bremmer, president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media.
And I'm Brad Smith, vice chair and president of Microsoft. Our Global Stage series gives you a front row seat at some of the most important gatherings around the world, from Davos to Munich to the UN General Assembly in New York.
And we host critical conversations about the biggest challenges the world is facing right now at the intersection of technology, politics, and society.
You'll hear from public and private sector leaders and innovators
on topics like cybersecurity, climate change, and ongoing war in Ukraine.
Join us for live streams, podcasts, and more throughout the year.
Head to gzeromedia.com/global stage and learn more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special GZERO presentation coming to you today from Davos, Switzerland, home for now, if you can believe it, 54 years. The World Economic Forum. I am Bianna Golodryga, anchor and Senior Global Affairs Analyst at CNN. This event is part of the Global Stage series, a partnership between GZERO and Microsoft. Our program, Making AI Work for the World, has two audiences today. Those of you watching all across GZERO social channels, and obviously the crowd gathered here in Davos. On stage today with me are some of the world's top experts, thinkers, and leaders in technology and AI policy. Omar Sultan Al-Alama is Minister of State for Artificial Intelligence in the United Arab Emirates and is known as the world's first AI minister. Welcome.
Thank you.
Brad Smith is Vice Chair and President of Microsoft. Eva Maydell is a member of the EU Parliament from Bulgaria, and her policy work has focused largely on technology and AI. Ian Bremmer is the founder and president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and Amandeep Singh Gill is the UN Secretary General's envoy on technology. Welcome, all of you. So as you can see, we're going to be approaching this conversation from a few different angles today. First, we're going to level set on the AI moment that the world is experiencing, a dominant theme here in Davos this year. We're going to talk about the risks and the rewards as they exist right now. And then we'll look at the regulatory environment. And finally, we'll define the title of this program, what AI is working for everyone really means. So I want to begin by asking all of you to define some of the biggest opportunities and some of the biggest threats from AI right now. And Minister, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. It's great being here, and thank you, Microsoft and GZERO, for hosting us. I'd like to say I'm old enough to say that I experienced a world where when you say Amazon, you think of a rainforest. And when you say Apple, you think of a fruit. And today, the first thing that comes to mind isn't the rainforest or the fruit. It's technology companies that have changed our lives. And that's thanks mostly to artificial intelligence, because over the last 10 years, these technologies have played a pivotal role in our lives. Our quality of lives have changed and improved. We today go to artificial intelligence for the answers to many questions, whether it's ChatGPT or Google. We ask artificial intelligence to take us from point A to point B. And we shop and consume and connect and communicate through artificial intelligence-enabled channels. So I would argue that over a very short period of time, I'm 33 years old, over the last 33 years, I've seen the world go from a world that does not depend on artificial intelligence to a world that's fully dependent on artificial intelligence. And I'm not representing today even the younger generation who have only known Amazon to be a technology platform rather than a rainforest, right? The other thing I want to say is I've been appointed in the year 3 BC, so 3 years before COVID, which seems like many lifetimes away.
You come with all the lines today.
I try at 8 a.m. So when I was appointed, the conversations were about self-driving cars and how important it is to try to put regulation to solve the trolley theory. And if that was not combated, there's going to be chaos around the world. We are 6 years in. I don't think anyone has put effective regulation yet to combat that. And governments have moved on. Today, talk about regulating generative AI, talk about regulating large language models. There is a need for us to move as fast as the technology is moving. We're moving much slower, I think. The private sector is trying to pull governments into the regulation conversation, which is great. But I think as governments, we need to be a little bit more agile. And the opportunities, I think, are huge. We've seen that in quality of life improvements. The risks are if something goes wrong and we are reactive, we tend to, as governments, over-regulate, which I think is going to affect us negatively. So there needs to be a Goldilocks scenario here of just right, getting the regulations proactively done in the right manner to ensure that innovation is not hindered, but at the same time to safeguard people's lives and livelihoods.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's fair to say that you do represent the young generation, at least in this room, this morning in participating. Thank you, Minister. Thank you. Brad?
Well, I would say, just to build on that, and I'd just say briefly, the opportunities are vast. They're quite varied. The opportunity to improve, science, drug discovery, medicine, healthcare, material science, climate science, just about everywhere one looks, and an enormous opportunity to drive productivity growth in a world that is relatively starved of productivity growth, which is a fundamental for economic growth. And then there's two broad threats we need to worry about as well. The first is that some bad actors will use this technology to accomplish bad things. So we need to protect against that. We need even to fight against that. And at the same time, and I think your comment addresses this very well, the world needs to adapt because it is bringing change. And so there is a risk that the world won't adapt as quickly as it should. Only by bringing these together can we ensure that fundamentally the innovation moves forward more or less in tandem, which I think should be the goal, with safety and the needs of people more broadly.
Eva?
Well, your question reminds me a little bit about the war of electricity currents between Edison and Westinghouse. I think they both had different approaches, but ultimately this fierce competition between them made sure that we experienced the second industrial revolution. We started to produce better, more efficient. We started to live better. So I very much hope that today's fierce competition between tech giants will ultimately lead to a new revolution that would make us live better, but most importantly, will make us achieve better things in an easier way. However, I think we also have the example of nuclear weapons, which did not necessarily increase security or limit conflicts. So with these two examples, I think in a way, AI at the moment is at a crossroad, and it's ultimately up to us which way AI is going to go. So I very much hope by putting the right guardrails in place and by enhancing international cooperation, we are going to be able to reap those benefits.
So comparatively near-term opportunities and risks. We're all here at the World Economic Forum. You walk down the promenade, literally everything has an AI wrapper on it. Just like, a lot of these buildings usually aren't what they are this week. A lot of these companies aren't necessarily what they are this week. But it is indicative. It is indicative that as a political scientist, usually when you have massive new technologies, you are seriously threatening someone with power, right? I mean, you want to do climate change and transition, you're telling the coal people, you're telling even the oil and gas people, we intend to put you out of business for good. And therefore, they have a very strong interest in stopping you from doing that. They'll do that publicly, but they'll really do it effectively privately with money. This is not that. I mean, when you look at artificial intelligence, you have the most important transformative technology, I would argue, of our lifetimes. And it's actually something that literally every incumbent actor knows that they can use for productivity and efficiency gains. So, I mean, it's not just that they want to have the wrapper, they want it to be real over time. That's a very exciting driver. That's the thing I'm most excited about. The thing I am most concerned about in the near to medium term is that society is not going to use this well, and we are not well positioned to govern that. Social media, we completely failed on, right? And we have an environment where in short order, Sam Altman came out yesterday and talked about this, I bet, on the Bill Gates podcast, I think it was, saying that one of the most exciting things he's going to roll out is we're going to train AI on your personal data, your individual data. When that happens, right, you're going to be using this all the time. But using it for what, right? And using it to connect with whom? And how is it changing you as a human being? This is not Yuval Harari's Homo Deus. This isn't a new human being, but this is an incremental change that is coming soon, like immediately, that has the potential to make people miserable and angry and polarized and profitable. And I worry about that. Right? I think that's the issue. I know the Europeans are very interested in this issue. I don't think we are positioned yet to handle this issue, and it's going to come very fast.
And obviously this is a global issue, which brings me to Amandeep. And why did the UN decide that they were ready right now to form a commission on AI?
Yes, because we don't want to wait for some of the risks to be realized before we put in place the responses. So it's important to be proactive at this stage. And there's been a very nice spectrum of optimism and pessimism on AI. And I'm happy that I'm sitting next to Ian, because I'm on the more anxious side today. And I think you set out the framework for this conversation very nicely, those 3 R's, the risks, rewards, and the regulation around it. And Ian put 2 more R's in there, the wrappers and the reality. So 2024 is going to be a reality check on these issues. We've got these elections coming up. We've got some interesting junctures in economics and politics this year. So what's going to be the productivity boost if that happens? What's going to be the impact on, we already see in the surveys, the impact on the job market, which is what politicians would have to handle. So we'll start to see some of these reality checks coming in. And the UN Secretary General wants to put in place a conversation early enough through the advisory body on AI, and it's great to have Ian and Omar here. They are both members of that advisory body, and we have a very able representative from Microsoft, and so it's a multi-stakeholder body. So look at what are the opportunities and what are the enablers you need to get to those opportunities, because they are not just going to fall from heaven. We need to make them work. What are the risks and the challenges in handling those risks? And then most importantly, what's the international governance layer look like? You know, the atomic energy example, the climate change example. We have some institutions from the past, but are they fit for purpose for AI? And how do we make sure that that works with the national regulatory effort and the industry-led efforts?
Yeah, we've sat you accordingly, from the rewards here to my left to the risks all the way at the end. Let's start with another R in our conversation, and that's regulation. 2023 brought a flurry of activity in this space, voluntary standards adopted by tech leaders, tech companies, gathering at the White House. We've had the Bletchley Declaration, and an executive order from President Joe Biden, and obviously the EU's AI Act. Ian, despite all of that, ungoverned AI is something that you've really focused on what to watch for this year. Your thoughts on this space?
My thoughts are, I'm delighted that there are so many government officials around the world that are taking this up with a matter of urgency. Just a year ago, they were very, very far from that. And it's important, and you recognize real progress. But this technology is moving faster than the governance. And by definition, and when we look at 2024, and the risk report only looks at the next 12 months, I think that the speed and pace of what AI is capable of doing and how it's going to be deployed is going to be, there's the gap between that and governance is actually still going to be growing. So that's the point of what ungoverned AI is. And I relish the fact that we are having useful conversations about comparative governance approaches of the United States and the EU and the United Nations and others. I think that's a really good thing. But that can't be the only conversation, because there is going to be a big component of this space that is driven by and determined by the technology itself, and therefore the business model of the companies that are driving the technology. And we don't spend much time thinking about the geopolitical implications of different business models. Let me go back to social media. There's a very big difference between whether LinkedIn is the dominant social media player in a global space or whether it's X. And by the way, there's a difference geopolitically between the owner of Twitter and the owner of X. Geopolitically, right? But no one talks about that when you talk about governance of social media. That's a mistake, right? In an environment where the technology companies act increasingly as sovereigns, You've got some companies, Microsoft, industrial company, B2B, very different approach to, a Google or an Amazon or a Chinese national company, national champion, or state-owned enterprise. And I think that we're going to have to spend a lot more time talking about implications of business models and change of business models for geopolitics. One final point for me on this. A lot of the big risks that we talk about long-term, like, are we going to have artificial general intelligence? Will the robots take over? Well, we have to have a business model for that, right? That doesn't happen by itself. You have to have something people want to invest in. I remember when I was younger, I was very excited by a book many people here will remember, Ray Kurzweil's Age of Spiritual Machines. Mm-hmm. And he predicted a lot of things that have happened. But he also predicted things that didn't happen. One of the things that didn't happen was reverse engineering the brains of increasingly, advanced animals. We're still not even at the earthworm. Why not? Because we haven't figured out a business model for that. Right? We don't know how to sell reverse engineering the brain of an earthworm, but we are really good at selling models of taking all of this data and doing predictive analytics on large language models. That's really cool. We need to understand what it is that actually is being driven by both the tech and the business. That needs to be a focus of geopolitics. I don't see that yet.
Well, we're very fortunate to hear from leaders like yourselves, but we also want to hear from what the public thinks. So ahead of this event, GZERO conducted a poll of its audience across social media channels, and the first question was, who should regulate AI to ensure ethical and fair use? A, government regulation, B, tech industry itself, C, international cooperation, D, no one, let it thrive. So for A, government regulation came in at 39%, B, tech industry itself, 6%, C, international cooperation, 45%, and no one let it thrive beat tech industry itself at 10%. So Brad, I'm sure you'd say the right combination is sort of an all of the above here. How do you feel about the current regulatory environment? And let's put it in the context of the social media companies, because a lot of it was name recognition, not only of the companies themselves, but of their leadership and who we would see testify before Congress, which became public, must-see viewing. Do you see that differing for AI?
Clearly, I believe the answer is yes. And with social media, the answer that emerged was D, do nothing, let it thrive. And so fundamentally what you hear around the world is people saying, we're not going to do that again. And what you then see emerging in contrast to that is actually a combination of the first three, as you said. It's really B, and then A, and then C. And by that I mean it's the industry creating at the foundation a set of practices, and even now beginning to collaborate on the early stages of what will probably emerge as industry standards. Say the standards in some ways around the process used to create foundation models, the safety testing by red teams, the kind of work that should take place to monitor them after they're deployed. You're then going to see national regulation and above that international cooperation. In many ways, I do think one of the most remarkable things that people will look back at a decade from now and remember from 2023 is both that the technology did move so fast, but actually governments did as well. And when you actually take everything that was done, the AI Act, the voluntary commitments, and then the executive order from the White House, the interim measures from the Chinese government last July, the G7 Hiroshima process, the UN advisory body, there is an awful lot of similarity. And we all talk about the differences, but we make a huge mistake if we miss how much they have in common. Pursuing a risk-based approach, establishing these safety standards, really requiring transparency and accountability. And we're going to need this international layer around it, and I think that is in some ways is the most complicated, but we're making progress there. That's actually quite remarkable. Now we do, I think, have to address Ian's very good point. Ultimately, one needs to understand the whole technology stack. 2023 was really a year where everybody just ran to and focused on the foundation models. And so now people are stepping back and they're realizing, wait, there's people who deploy AI in applications. There's issues at the chip layer, the data layer. All of these need to come together. And economics and business models do matter as well. But we should actually reflect on the fact that for the first time in the history of digital technology, governments are moving quickly, and they're moving more or less by learning, talking, and even coordinating with each other.
Yeah, and Eva, to that point, the EU once again has gotten further than most governments thus far in terms of regulation. We had the AI Act last year. Talk about the central proposals here involved in the Act, and is there a sense that government bodies understand the technology well enough?
Well, it's an excellent question, whether they do understand the technology well enough. And I think this is different also compared to whether you put a legislation in place or whether your government, your nation state is prepared to legislate on one hand, but most importantly to enforce and also to have the prepared professionals to be able to use those tools when it comes to the way nation states and government works. But on your question on the AI Act, so first of all, I would also agree that we were rather timely with our efforts. We delivered in a swifter manner than usual. And the main areas that we've addressed, so first and foremost for us was important that we develop AI according to our democratic values. This is the notion with which the European Parliament put forward its first proposal on the table. Then what we managed to do is to have a risk-based approach. So the riskier the technology, the more, so to say, things it needs to obey to, the more checks and balances it will need to undergo. But for us, it was also important to address foundational models. We call them general purpose AI in our report. And there, I believe we've struck the right balance in between allowing companies to continue innovating, but in the same time, certain of those companies that have a larger effect and are bigger will also undergo more checks and balances. In order for Europe to continue to be competitive and companies to want to deploy that technology in Europe, but also develop it in Europe, because I don't know, but speaking of data, 80% of Europe's products and services in that area are foreign, they're not European. We managed to have a research exemption, we introduced measures related to sandboxes and a couple of other things in order to balance our approach. But I do believe when it comes to the years to come, Europe will need to do much more to attract investment, to attract talent, and find different measures and tools that are currently not foreseen in the AI Act, because, as I said, it has a different purpose. And I believe we've delivered to that purpose for the time being.
So not to be Debbie Downer here, but a lot of what you've implemented can take months, if not years, to actually see enforced. Are you concerned that that's just running too slow given the quick speed at which the technology involved in AI is developing?
So first of all, we've struck the political deal, but in about a month, we are going to finally vote the entire file in the plenary of the European Parliament. And then the first provisions will enter into force after 6 months, and they will be targeting the prohibited and banned practices. And later on, when it comes to Gen AI, it would probably be in a year from now. But this time, we have taken a bit of a different approach in terms of how we are actually going to collaborate between the national authorities that will be in charge of implementation and the European authorities. We have set up a concrete EU AI office, which will be in charge of having a more flexible approach of how it looks in terms of implementation of the legislation, with more prepared professionals, with people that do understand the technology, as we believe that right now we don't necessarily have the prepared staff at a EU level and a national level. So there will be a lot of efforts put on the implementation part from the EU in the next 6 months.
And if I could, I would say it's important to recognize everybody, on the one hand, focuses on when will there be a law, when does its implementation date take effect. These things have already changed the way companies are building and deploying AI models. It's really redefined in many ways the state of the art for safety. Certainly responsible and reputable companies want to show that they are being safe. And it's changed the discussion, it's changed hiring, it's changed business processes. The goal is to be in compliance well before the date arrives. So it can look a little bifurcated from the outside, but in fact, things are influencing each other very quickly.
That is exactly what we've seen with previous legislation, actually. The moment we start working on it and it's kind of toward its end of adoption, we see companies starting to comply a little bit earlier than the date of entry into force of the legislation.
So there are a couple of important points here. One is that so far it's been largely a G7 European North American conversation. That's a big gap. The global south needs to come into the governance conversation, not into that there are benefits for the SDGs and his wonderful stuff happening and it'll flow down to you. So we need to change this pretty fast. The other is, if you dig down into the psychological drivers of the regulatory response today, whether it's nation states, regions, or the companies, it's essentially two motivators. One is, how can I manage the short-term risk to national security or to customer trust? So, addressing the risks in a sense. Second one is, how can I preserve my competitive strengths? So really, deep down, those are the psychological motivators. They need to change to longer-term consideration of individual well-being, community well-being, human rights, fundamental freedoms, respect for those issues, and also to building a more robust, resilient innovation ecosystem. We don't want to be stuck down like, Roman chariots and then you have the railway lines. You don't want to be stuck down in some model. Some tech approaches around which you have very profitable business models and that constrains the innovation space in AI, which can be truly revolutionary. But we have to really, at this point, if you narrow it down too quickly, then you don't diversify the innovation ecospace, there's not going to be benefit for the SDGs.
Yeah. Minister, a two-pronged question to you based on what we just heard now from Amandeep as well. The UAE is taking a bit of a different route to approaching this issue. You're cautioning that fear may be behind some of this regulation and perhaps too much. And at the same point, you're also wanting to open the door to developing nations, to the global south. Talk about that.
So I'd just like to touch upon a point that you mentioned in the beginning, which is optimism towards pessimism. And I'd like to say I can't afford to be an optimist. I can't afford to be a pessimist. As a government official, my job is to be in the middle, dead center. Try to regulate against the pessimism, try to embrace and accelerate the optimistic uses of this technology. The other thing I want to say is we're at a very interesting inflection point in our history as a civilization. There are three main challenges that daunt us, and all of them have very similar attributes. The first is artificial intelligence. It's a technology that will cross borders. It's a technology that we need to actually be proactive towards rather than reactive. And the third, it's a technology that requires a vast amount of data and a vast amount of resources to try to contain and confine in the right ways. The same can be said about climate change. It crosses borders. It's a matter of time. We need to be proactive. We need to put a lot of resources and actually work together on this. And the third is pandemics, right? So the three of them are emerging at the same time as three big challenges that humanity needs to face. We understand in the UAE that we cannot regulate in the UAE just for the UAE. It's impossible because we know that these technologies are being built all around the world. There needs to be some sort of cooperation, and we've been calling for this since 2017, since I was appointed. The other thing is, I had an interesting conversation when I was first appointed with a minister not from the global south, actually from the global north. And I was talking about why the Minister of AI portfolio was created and all of that. And that minister from a leading country said, I'm glad to hear that a country like the UAE is going to appoint someone the age of my son to work on a hypothetical technology that will not really impact people's lives. This was in 2017.
You want to name names?
I would rather respect his privacy. But
this is the way the French just appointed the foreign minister, by the way. It was basically the same.
The issue that you have is most of the times it's ignorance that is leading the conversation. Whether it's even in the UAE in 2017, we were actually ignorant about the technology. We had to educate ourselves. We had to increase our knowledge and then approach the regulation conversation. There are, unfortunately, certain players that are approaching this with ignorance. What I love about the UN's approach, and I am on the advisory board of the UN, The conversation is led not just by the expertise, but the different players that can bring more to the table to ensure that everyone actually improves their knowledge and their understanding of regulation, at least puts forward a recommendation that can be implemented. Some of the conversations that we're having on regulation cannot be implemented. It's impossible. There is an interesting thing when we talk about social media. So we haven't regulated social media. What is social media? It's artificial intelligence. At the end of the day, it's an artificial intelligence engine that is actually charging this and allowing it to grow and to actually enter our lives and to control us. We did not regulate AI 15 years ago when social media came out. And we are today failing to move fast enough. We are failing to act. And we are failing to do it in a collaborative way where all of us can come together. The only way this can work, and I've talked about this on the regulation side, there are different approaches that we need to consider. The first is countries need to have sovereignty. So there needs to be a regulation that happens on the local level where countries feel like they are in control of their own fate and where they're going to go. There needs to be cooperation on certain use cases of artificial intelligence. The challenge with saying you want to regulate AI is that you're actually saying you want to regulate a field of computer science. There are so many things under that statement, under artificial intelligence, that you can't necessarily regulate AI. You can regulate certain verticals of artificial intelligence, which we need to do. We need to move faster on some than the other. I think disinformation, deepfakes, this risk, especially on the political landscape today with all the elections that are coming up, is a risk that is like climate change, that's like pandemic. A matter of time, we need to move very, very quickly, and not enough is being done. And we have to do it wherein all countries agree that this is bad for all of us. It's bad whether you are a Chinese government official, an Emirati government official, an American government official, whoever you are. Because if someone can create a fake version of you saying something that's going to disrupt the political landscape in your country, it's extremely bad. Where are the conversations? We are having these conversations at the UN, but I think most of the conversations are talking about regulating AI as an umbrella technology, which I think is a non-starter, unfortunately. We need to think about what risks are actually at the forefront, where are we already late, or what steps we need to do pragmatically today.
Ian, not to be too much of a cynic here, but in terms of what we saw with the tech companies and social media saying publicly to lawmakers, please, we want regulation, but I'm going to make this so hard for you to understand that it's probably behind closed doors better for us to handle. What lessons can be learned from what we saw there? And do you think approaching AI needs to be fundamentally different?
Look, I do believe that the initial process with 7 foundational AI companies in the United States that got together and recognized the U.S. government did not have the capacity or the expertise internally to handle this and say, look, these are some areas that we know we're going to need direction on, guardrails on. We can work together. They're areas that we can voluntarily commit, and they're relatively low common denominators because we all happen to agree. They're not places where our business models are in contradiction. But that was, I think, much more significant than anyone would have expected at the beginning of last year. I call that a win. And I agree with Brad that I think that the general orientation of most of the regs we've seen so far, whether they've been high-level private sector driven, like in the US, or they've been mostly government and technocratic driven, like in the EU, are more aligned than you would expect on a lot of these issues. I am happy with that. But I want to go to what Omar just said, which is that this cannot be regulated just as an umbrella. And we've learned that in our UN process as well. There are all these different working groups, and they have very different approaches. If you're talking about what industry is going to need to use AI in proprietary ways to ensure that their businesses are productive and competitive, especially with national security implications for the West vis-a-vis, let's say, the Chinese or others, then that's a different regulatory environment than one that affects human beings as you roll out to consumers. And I worry greatly. I do not just want us to understand what happens if we red team a foundational model to make sure that it can't be used to create a weapon. That's important. I know we need to do that. But I want to test these things on societies and on children before we roll them out. I want to know what the implications are. We would have benefited from that with social media.
Definitely.
Right? I mean, for decades, we have all been raised by institutions that are eroding. They are collapsing. In the United States, it's not just we don't trust the government, we don't trust the church, we don't trust the media. Those institutions are not as much a part of our lives. We don't spend as much time with people that are helping us become civic-minded, helping us become a community. And instead, we are being disintermediated by algorithms, as Omar just said. That has an impact on us as people. It has an impact on our society. It makes democracy less functional. The Chinese understand this, right? They are going to put serious guardrails on that. But it's not in the interest of the private sector to say, I need you to regulate that. Please regulate me. I haven't seen anyone say that, right? And I don't think you're going to. But the governments need to step up there. The international community needs to step up there because we will destroy social fabric to a greater degree than we already have if we ignore this issue.
And at a much faster pace.
At a much faster pace.
So that brings us to our next conversation, and that is making AI work for everyone. And again, in terms of how the polls were responded to this question, there's a lot of cynicism out there. GZERO asked its followers the following question: will AI contribute to greater equality in society? A, yes, significantly. B, yes, somewhat. C, not at all. D, unsure. So yes, 13%. B, yes, somewhat, 14%. C, no, not at all, 57%. And unsure, 16%. So I'd like to ask all of you, in terms of the concern over AI being a tool for equality or a weapon simply to exacerbate existing divides, where do you, I feel like you're going to be sitting on the former here, but in terms of what can be done to prevent this tool from dividing societies even more, your thoughts?
It depends on what the government's approach. If I'm going to talk about my expertise here, it depends on where governments sit when it comes to regulating AI and deploying AI. So we've taken the direction of saying we want to be a responsible nation when it comes to artificial intelligence. We don't want to deploy AI just for productivity gains or for economic gains. We're actually going to deploy AI for the improvement of quality of life, because we believe that quality of life is what's going to drive a country's competitiveness in the future. It's going to drive the economy. It's going to drive society. So when the public understands that this is your direction, they tend to be more optimistic. The second is, AI comes with a lot of stigma. We've been raised, as Ian Bremmer said, we've been raised through years of content that talks about the robots taking over, AI destroying the world, iRobot, the different, Terminator, the different content, movies, books that talked about AI being a very bad actor and that we're going to lose control and it's going to destroy us. On the other side, on the flip side, we don't have enough content that talks about how AI is going to improve our lives. There are very few examples of that. So the public typically tend to be pessimistic because of what they've grown up with. They've grown up with all of that content. When you empower them with understanding what AI is, how it can serve them, how it can improve their lives, and as well make them understand what the risks are, they tend to sit more towards the middle. They tend to have a balanced approach. I want to give you 3 examples. The first is, we went and did something called the AI camp. So across the summer vacations and the winter vacations in the UAE, we do something called the AI camp. It's targeted for different groups of people, young students, even nursery kids, talking about algorithmic thinking and what algorithms are and what ethics are, like in a very simplified sense, as well as primary school, secondary school, university students, and employees across the UAE. We've also done something where on the 29th of October, every single person in the UAE, through our telecom providers, gets an SMS that says, technology is going to drive our future. If you want to start the journey of learning what technology is and how you can play a role, click the following link. And they can go and write a line of code, then go into understanding how they can be working on AI. Over 180,000 people have used that today and have gone through that journey. And finally, government officials, the biggest fear that they have is they'll be sitting in a room and someone like Microsoft is going to come with ChatGPT and say you should be using it. And they have no idea if that's good or bad. And they do not know what questions to ask. And they do not know how to approach it. So we launched a program with the University of Oxford where our government officials in the UAE go through an 8-month time period of modules and courses to understand the ethics of AI, to understand what good AI and bad AI is, what AI is as a hype and what it actually can do, and so on and so forth, and deploy AI. Today, over 400 government officials in the UAE are the leaders that are actually taking the charge when it comes to artificial intelligence. If you took that poll in the UAE, I would argue the percentage on yes, it's going to serve me is going to be higher. Not because this was artificially created, but because people understand what it means. They don't think that, oh, this artificial technology is going to change our lives. Anything artificial seems negative. Anything artificial seems like something that's not good for us. That is a problem. It comes with a lot of stigma.
Definitely not one of the camps I went to. It's fascinating to hear the initiatives.
You can join.
That maybe my kids will come. Brad, a case study on this issue could be globalization over the past several decades. And obviously there's concern that we could see the same for AI. How do you view it? Benefiting some while dividing and really hurting a large sector?
I think there's a huge opportunity and there's some challenges we need to overcome. The opportunity that's worth remembering is that in many ways AI lowers the barriers to entry for people performing important work, entering a profession. The barrier to coding or to doing all sorts of things. You can do it in multiple languages that you don't speak. Literally, it enables people who are not literate to talk and accomplish important things. And in that sense, it actually offers at least the potential to start to reverse what has been a 35-year trend of digital technology exacerbating income inequality, really around the world, most especially for people with less education. It's not necessarily going to happen by itself. It requires real work, including with frontline workers, with labor organizations, with governments around the world, to ensure that the skills that are needed to use it are distributed broadly, to frankly ensure that the benefits of productivity growth are distributed broadly. But there is this critical need for the Global South that I also think is actually worth at least pausing on for a moment. You cannot make productive use of AI as a society or a community or as a home or a business unless you have electricity. And this morning, there are still 700 million people, including 43% of the people in Africa, who do not have electricity. So in a sense, we do the Global South, in my view, a tremendous disservice if we talk about AI all the time as the next thing, which actually does create, in my view, a benefit to leapfrog in some ways other countries, without taking account of all of the technologies that need to come together to make productive use of this and have a strategy to close the electricity divide, the broadband connectivity divide, the device divide, and then you can close the AI divide on top of it. And that just underscores this is pretty complicated, but we need to think broadly.
It's really an excellent point. Ava, you want to add anything?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I think the results do not surprise me, at least having in mind the various discussions and conversations taking place within society and within Europe over the past couple of months and I think the past year. So clearly it's a very important topic. The narrative is perhaps not as convincing on the side of how technologies have improved our life until now and what they can do further. But maybe you would call me short-sighted, but there's something that keeps me up at night, and it's just the year to come before us. And what AI and tech means for the biggest year of elections ever. I'm worried about deceptive content that can be created faster, can be disseminated faster, and it can divide and it can radicalize our society. So for me, for the year to come, I would perhaps prefer to focus in that arena, making sure that our information environment does not become entirely toxic. So I would like to see more efforts coming from the side of the private sector, more efforts from the public sector, and thirdly, the two collaborating and understanding each other a little bit more. I think when we talk about geopolitics, there's little understanding from the private sector on that topic, But I think the public sector also understands a little bit less nowadays the private sector. So I think it will be an important year maybe where the two can talk more to each other and find common solutions in order for citizens not to lose trust. I mean, the topic of this year's annual meeting is rebuilding trust. I don't want that the year to come is the year where citizens will lose trust in the most democratic process that we know and trust. I hope so.
Well, believe it or not, there's more than just the U.S. election this year. I think there's 69 other elections around the world. Ian, I know you wanted to weigh in on this issue, perhaps the elections, but also on what Brad was focusing on.
Look, I'm worried about the disinformation around the elections before you get to AI, right? I mean, like, we've got some foundational issues here, and the United States, the biggest election, is absolutely the most problematic in this regard. Though we just had a Taiwan election that people were worried about, and actually disinformation didn't play a significant role in it. The Chinese were involved a little bit, and they were largely shut down, and that was interesting.
Yeah.
But my point here is getting to the broader impact of this new wave of globalization. And I think that's what we should think about, right? Because the last wave of globalization created incredible amounts of wealth, created a global middle class, that's a really positive thing, made a small number of people incredibly rich, but also really undermined and hollowed out a bunch of working and middle class people in the developed world. I mean, it was about 15 years ago that we were all talking about Thomas Piketty, you know, and capital in France, and the fact that globalization had this backlash. And now we're dealing with it, right? So how is AI different? And I think it's not different in one way, and Brad put his finger on it, which is that if you're, you know, sort of not going to be in a position personally to have your human capital unlocked, you're still going to be left behind in a big, big way, in a bigger way than before. So that has to be addressed. Amandeep, the UN, the Global South has to be brought in quickly so these people have an opportunity. That is a smaller lift than it was 50 years ago, but it's a lift that needs to be done urgently. You don't have the time that you used to have, right? That's one point. But the second point, and this is an interesting one, you just saw the IMF and Kristalina and Gita come out with their story that said that 40% of jobs around the world are going to be affected. They didn't say exactly what they meant by affected. 60% in the developed world by AI. But unlike the working and middle classes who were automated away and free traded away and Chinese and India manufactured away, here we're talking about actually people with a lot of education, with a lot more money, that have much more access to political power. And so on the upside, they're going to have more ability to ensure that the social contract is adjusted as their jobs become disrupted, to make sure that there is a safety net for their kids, that there is a trajectory, that they have training, that they have access. They'll be better capable of retooling themselves. Those are good things. On the negative side, Neil Ferguson, if he were here, would be talking about the fact that the proletariats don't revolt. The bourgeois, when there are too many of them and they lose their jobs, they revolt. They take advantage of the anger down there and they say, you're done. And there is a risk that if we don't get that right, we'll be in trouble. And you know, this is a time in the United States when labor's powerful. And I'm watching what just happened in the automotive industry. And on the one hand, they had a lot of leverage. They got a great deal, one that they probably should have pushed for a long time ago. But they pushed for that deal at a time that the automotive industry is in trouble and is being transformed by EVs. And those EV companies don't need these highly paid, highly trained workers. My concern is that these jobs are going to be disrupted, but as long as companies are making a lot of money, they're not going to be shedding a lot of workers. What's going to happen is the next time we have a down cycle, after 3 years, 5 years of incredible AI, you're going to have a lot of companies all of a sudden saying, where can I shed costs? And they're going to hit these people all at once. Yeah. So you have to be ready for that. That's the concern that I have.
Yeah, I think one of the sobering points in this IMF report was that not only that 40% of all jobs would be impacted, but also some of them, many of them would be eliminated. And that brings me to you, Amandeep, because it's great that there are these advisory boards and this is an issue that you're focusing on, but the track record, if you just look back, is pretty frustrating in terms of including the Global South, including developing countries, when you look at climate change, when you look at COVID, right, and vaccine distribution. What can be done in terms of lessons learned from the past to make sure that doesn't happen with AI?
Absolutely. So there's a trust deficit with the Global South today. People are skeptical. And I think AI is a test case now. addressing the digital divide just got harder. I mean, Brad's point about, there are layers of it, and we just added another layer, significant layer. So if we do not today involve the Global South in these conversations on AI governance in a meaningful way, if we do not involve the Global South in a meaningful way on the opportunities that Omar outlined in a meaningful way, then we would widen that trust deficit, and that has geopolitical implications. I think on the opportunities side, don't read my pessimism wrong. I love the technology. I come from this area myself, and I think there's tremendous potential for accelerating science and discovery, tremendous potential for improving quality of life, government services, in a sense taking the digital transformation to the next level. But that's not going to be delivered through the current business models. Because what's happening today is technology is getting wrapped around existing business models, which work through certain kind of platforms, devices, interfaces, etc. So there's nothing new there, really. What we need to see is that there is focused investment, public-private partnerships, in realizing those opportunities outside of existing business models. So a distributed CERN type of approach where you put together data in data commons on agriculture and food security, new varieties of plant. There's no money to be made there immediately, but we need to work together on those issues. That'll build you the trust with the Global South. And if people are really serious about the Sustainable Development Goals on bridging the digital divide, I will lend my support to whatever is being put together on AI governance in the interest of everyone. For now, we have a challenge.
Fascinating conversation. I know you all have very busy schedules today, a lot planned for the third day here at Davos and the World Economic Forum. So thank you so much for joining us. That does it for us. I want to thank our panel, Minister Omar Sultan Al-Ulama, Brad Smith, Ava Maydell, Ian Bremmer, and Amandeep Singh Gill. And you all at GZERO, thank you so much for joining us. You can watch all of GZERO's ongoing coverage of the 2024 forum by heading to gzeromedia.com/global stage. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Bianna Golodryga. Have a wonderful day.